So I've been using these chopsticks for a while now, and they were like a $2 version that I found at the supermarket. They're super cheap, and they really don't work that well. They seem to warp in the sink, and they've got this super weird coating on them that makes them grippy, I guess, but doesn't really end up working out that well. So we're going to make a new set of chopsticks. We're going to make them out of walnut and then do an accent with some hickory that I had laying around. But first we have to make a jig so that we can plane it down and get that taper on there. So first thing I'm going to do is cut an angle in the walnut blank so that we can inlay the hickory. It doesn't really matter what the angle is, it's just to add a little bit more interest in the chopstick. Kind of makes the project a little more fun. Here I'm just cutting a little 1/8" strip of hickory to put in between the walnut blanks. I'm really not a huge fan of cutting small stuff like this on the table saw. If I had a bandsaw, I'd probably use it, but gotta work with what you've got. So I'm just lining up all of the blanks here to make sure that everything's gonna fit nicely and that I don't need to plane anything down. During the glue up, I just wanna make sure that I get full coverage on there since it's gonna be around water and it's really a small area. It's only 1/4 by 1/4 where the inlay is gonna be, so we wanna make sure that the glue joint's really tight. Kind of messed up here, thought that I was gluing the whole thing, but really just scraped it off of there. Doesn't have to be perfect since we're going to be sawing it off later. Here I'm just putting in between the bench dogs so that we can get it clamped up. I'm using a Craig jig clamp so that I can get some side pressure on there, since if I just clamped it down from the end, it would shoot out both sides. Just want to make sure that everything's flat on there and clean up as much glue as possible. We're going to end up planing it down anyways. Here I'm getting started on flattening the top of the jig. Doesn't have to be perfect, but as flat as we can get it, the better the chopsticks are going to turn out, since the dimension on them relies on the slots that we're going to cut in the top. The ones I had before were right around 9 inches. The overall dimension on them felt fine, it was just that they were super light and they wanted to flex everywhere. I'm making a mark on our tapering jig just across there because we're going to cut a dado for a stop to go in there, so when we're planing it, the blank will rest up against it. We don't have to worry about it moving around. We're also going to add one on the bottom. I'm just offsetting that at about 1 inch so that it can hook onto the table. That way the jig doesn't slide around when we're using the planer. Before I cut the dados for the stops, I'm setting my blade to 1/4 inch, which is the depth of our blanks. We're going to make our first squaring cut, which just makes sure that we can put our blank chopstick that's 1/4 by 1/4 into the slot and then use the plane to get a perfect dimension on there. I'm just running it straight through and then nudging my blade over. That way we get a little bit wider than 1/4 inch so our chopstick doesn't struggle to fit inside. Since our chopsticks go from 1/4 down to 1/8 inch, I'm just cutting an 1/8 inch shim to put just behind the mark where our stop is going. That way when we run it through the table saw with our blade height set at 1/4 inch, it's going to taper down from 1/8 of an inch all the way to 1/4. Since we're going to be running this through the table saw, I'm just trimming it down so that it fits the width of the board. I'm using some masking tape and some super glue. Makes a really easy way to attach something to wood without ruining it, and it's super easy to take off. Just putting a little super glue on, and then I'll put a little spray of accelerator onto the opposite side. After I do that, you get a super tight bond and it's almost instant. Once I get this put on, I'm going to run it through again to make my tapering slot. What this is going to do, it's just going to allow me to set the 1/4 by 1/4 inch blank in there. And then once it's set in and we run our plane over it, it's going to taper one end down to 1/8 of an inch. We'll do a 1/4 turn and then it'll taper the other side. That way we go down from 1/4 inch at the top all the way down to 1/8 at the bottom. Here I'm just running it through in the same process that we did the other 1/4 inch squaring slot. Just going at 1/4 inch and bumping it over just a little bit more so that it doesn't fit too tight. The last slot I'm going to cut is for the chamfering, so I need to get a 45-degree angle on it, but I still wanted the taper on it, so I'm going to cut the tapering slot first, and then once the tapering slot is set, I'll run a V-chamfer bit down the middle of it so that it creates a little bit of a slot. But that way the height stays the same and we can get almost a perfect octagon. I'm just using a chisel to pop the shim off that we put on earlier. Comes off super easy and there's really no mess. Using a 1/4 inch chisel to clean up the inside of the grooves just makes it so that it's smoother and that it doesn't really rock on anything. The last thing I'd want is for it to come out bowed and I'd be stuck back where we started. I had another scrap piece of walnut laying around, so I'm going to use that for the stops. I'm just ripping a 1/2 inch wide strip so that it'll fit in the data that we're going to cut in the bottom. I've got plenty here, so I'm just cutting a full strip, and then I'll cut it to length with the handsaw at the end once we get it fit up. I want to cut it before, because then I'm going to set my height exactly to what it measured at. Using a cross-cut sled to cut these, just making a pass through. Blade height set at about 1/2 inch. That way it has some nice bite and it's not going to go anywhere. Also, it gets it past that 1/4 inch slot so that it fits in there. First fit up was definitely too tight, so I just took another shave off of it and ended up working out just fine. Now it fits perfectly tight and we just need to add a little bit of glue. Cleaning this up with a chisel as well, that way it sits flush in the bottom, and then taking my pole saw and just trimming it flush. Just adding a little glue into the bottom of it, that way it doesn't go anywhere. I'm still spreading it out and trying to get full coverage on the glue up, but really it doesn't matter all that much. Most of it's going to be held by the actual mortise in there anyways. Just using that same clamp again to hold it while I glue the other one. It really didn't go anywhere. They're super tight, so I was able to take it off right after I did this one. This one fit really tight after I glued it up, but a few taps with a hammer and it sat in there just fine. Here I'm just planing the top down. It was already pretty flat, so I was able to do full pulls, but this just makes sure that it's easier to run through the table saw and we're not going to get caught on anything. After I finish this, I'm just going to clamp it sideways again on the bench and then use my pole saw to trim those edges. I am going to end up planing those flat as well because we're going to put that on the fence and that's going to be a reference edge for our first cut. Still throwing it on the table saw since hand planing like this, you can't necessarily get a perfectly square edge. So I'm just taking a hair off of it, squaring up this edge, flipping it around, and then I've got a relatively square blank before we cut them. So I set the table saw at a 1/4 inch. That way we make our first cut, and then out of each one of these blanks, we're going to be able to get a pair of chopsticks. We're just going to flip it 90 degrees. This is what I really hate and why I really wish I had a bandsaw. Or a zero clearance insert at least, but that'll come later. This was just a little sketchy. Using the pencil is really nice. Keep your fingers away from it, but I really wouldn't recommend it unless you've spent a ton of time around a table saw. Now I'm just lining all these up. I really want them to be uniform, so I'm taking the angles and making sure they all match up. Then I'm taking masking tape and just putting it on both sides. That when we run it through the table saw, it's not going to fly apart and the lines will stay uniform. After I do that, I'm just marking off my 9 inches and then taking it over to the table saw and we'll trim that up. Back to the jig, I'm just taking my pole saw and making sure that that flattens out and then hitting it with the hand plane. After I finish that, I'm going to hit it with some 220 just to make sure it's nice and smooth before we put the paste wax on there. It's not super crucial to get every little bit of it, but honestly, I just wanted it to look nice since I feel like I'm going to have this around the shop for a while. I'm using the Howard brand paste wax. Really doesn't matter what you use, and you can use pretty much any finish on there. But since I want it to slide nice, I'm just applying an even coat all the way around it and then waiting a little bit for it to dry. And then I'll go ahead and buff it out. That way it's ready to go. I made my first big mistake in the project here, and I realized that I forgot to cut the 45-degree angle for the chamfering slot. So I kind of jerry-rigged something together where I could keep my taper and use the router, but as you'll see here, that definitely did not turn out. At this point, I was just super excited to get it done. I didn't bother to reclamp it, and I went freehand, and ultimately it came back to bite me.
Let's try it again.
So what I ended up doing off camera is I just cut another slot with just the V-grip. It's not going to set it to the exact height, but I can just count strokes on there and figure out if it'll work. So I'm finally getting to put the jig through its paces. I'm just taking the 1/4 inch blanks and sticking it in the squaring side. I went through all of those first and then moved it over, tapered all of them, and then went through and chamfered. After that, I just hit it with some 220 sandpaper and they're ready for finishing. So I wanted to be food safe, so I'm just using cutting board oil, which really is just pure mineral oil. And I'm coating these fully, and I'm going to let them soak for a good 20 or 30 minutes. That way we get as much in there and it protects it from moisture. After I soak it, I just wipe them down, let them dry for probably about an hour, just to make sure everything gets soaked up, and we're done. These things ended up turning out way better than I expected, and honestly, for my first try, I'm really happy about it. If you guys made it this far, thank you so much for taking the time to watch. This was a super fun project. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe so that you can see more of this content as I come out with it. I really appreciate your support. Also, comment below if there's anything that you want to see made. See you next time.